shocks of a trade overhaul are rippling through the U.S. economy. Businesses are now facing the prospect of rerouting shipments, rethinking sourcing, and revamping supply chains. Tariffs, after all, don't just raise costs. They have the power to change where, how, and even if goods move at all. Today's guest has been a clear public voice giving real-time updates on the disruption. So we invited him on the call to ask what is, to my mind, one of the biggest questions of the moment. How will tariffs reshape the flow of global trade? Joining us now is Ryan Petersen, founder and CEO of logistics platform Flexport. Ryan, welcome to the call.
Good. Thanks for having me on.
Now, Ryan, you run a logistics company. You help customers manage their supply chains. You're right in the thick of it. And I realize it's still early days, but what are you seeing? Are there any signs of long-term shifts in traffic patterns?
Well, it's hard to talk about the long term right now because things are changing day to day. It seems like several times a week there's an update. And in fact, maybe that is the big change right now, is that people feel somewhat paralyzed. They'd like to take some action, but it's very difficult to shift your supply chain when you find a new factory in a new country when you don't know what the tariffs are going to be. So I think for the moment, at least the next 60, 90 days, we'll see how long it takes to negotiate these deals and have the rates kind of settle in where people can start to make longer term plans. That's kind of the word of the day, is a little bit of paralysis.
Well, to that point, ocean freight for a while there was down as much as 50%, but now it's back up somewhat. But where the tariff levels are there, it seems really inconsistent. They're going up, they're going down. Those can cause bottlenecks and shortages, right? I wonder what you see from your vantage point on that front.
Yeah, so that's the very interesting result of this so far, is the tariffs when they hit on April 9th, especially that 145% tariff on China, that caused a massive drop in ocean freight volumes. We saw a bookings decline of 60% industry-wide. So 60% decline in ocean freight from China to the United States. That lasted for the full 5 weeks that the tariffs were in effect. And then effectively immediately when it was released, when they were paused and the tariffs were brought down to 30% on China, bookings surged. And now you've got a 70 to 80% increase of bookings over the rates, over the volumes that you were seeing before the tariffs even began.
Now, does that cause congestion?
Yes. And so there's a large amount of congestion. This week is a little bit lower. You're now more like up 50% in volume over prior periods. But you've got, you can picture this big drop and then this huge surge, but there's not enough ships to move that much cargo. In fact, there's there are fewer ships than there were before, because during the drop in bookings, the ocean carriers that operate these container ships, they pulled about 25% of those ships and moved them down to Latin America, to Africa, from Asia to Europe, Vietnam, other trade lanes. And so that capacity is not there right now to move this huge surge of bookings that's coming through. So you're seeing congestion pricing. The price of ocean freight's gone up. We're seeing we'll see where it lands in June, but we're probably talking about $6,000 for a container, where normal long run average about $2,000. And you will see shortages, was your original question, if this lasts for much longer. If this booking surge stays high for 4 or 5 weeks, I think you're going to see this high pricing and lack of not enough capacity to move that much freight through the summer. But if it normalizes this week, probably the whole thing goes without notice.
You've warned of the unintended consequences of tariffs. We import a lot of consumer goods from China, but this chart shows that more than 2/3 of what we import are capital goods, components, raw materials, stuff that we use in manufacturing. If we tariff these industrial inputs at 30%, what will it do to U.S. supply chains?
That's a great chart. And the fact is, I've talked to more manufacturers in the United States who are shutting down manufacturing and moving it offshore as a result of the tariffs than I haven't really met anyone who's excited about the tariffs and think it's going to help them, because they all rely on imported components. And there's a few, I talked to at least one who their finished goods, they got an exemption. Exemption to certain products, and gave the finished goods. I don't want to. The finished goods were subject, were duty free, but the components weren't.
Wow.
And so all of a sudden, as a U.S. manufacturer, he's like, I got to pay duties. I better to produce this thing offshore. So also the inconsistency in how it's applied and the sort of seeming randomness of what got exempted and what didn't. has made it very difficult for manufacturers. The other one is people who are exporting, because you got to pay these duties on the way in. You create the goods, you export them. Getting duty drawback every year in the United States, over $7 billion goes unclaimed. I got to plug this for everybody that you're owed refunds of $7 billion. American companies are, that they don't claim on their customs duties, because if you import something and you later export it, you're owed a refund. But it takes you about a year to get the refund. So like you're trying to operate a business, you can't, it doesn't work. So American manufacturers who export are really hurt by the tariffs as well.
So I've got one audience question coming in right now. Is there any indication that ships are waiting offshore to see if the tariffs go down?
They were, those have all been put back into service now. So there, of that 25% of ships that I said that were pulled, the capacity from China to the US that got pulled, 16 of the 25 has already returned to service. And we're short about 9% right now.
Or well, some say, here's another question from an audience member. Some say a part of the strategy is to maintain uncertainty on tariffs, believing that that will drive reshoring to the US. Do you see any of that?
I kind of believe that's part of the strategy. It seems like it. If there's a strategy, they're definitely driving the uncertainty. So, what's that saying? The purpose of a system is what it does. And it does seem that's what that's what all this is doing.
Well, now you've been a vocal advocate for small businesses in particular. We at the Chamber have been expanding that practice area as well. Why are tariffs so hard on small businesses? Is it because this just makes up a bigger part of their cash flow, or what's the dynamic there?
I think it's because bigger companies have, first of all, companies with large margins and good businesses tend to become big. So like that's why they're big. They're like better businesses on some level. I don't mean that as in a moral sense, but just in the terms of like the reason they got big is because it was a great business that compounded and grew very large. So they should have more margin. They should have better resources. But more importantly, the scale that has makes them very attractive to a new manufacturer in a new country. So if you want to set up, plus you have scale to say, hey, let's produce the same product in more than one country. And so you have companies, larger companies often will produce a product in China and in Vietnam and in Cambodia. And a small company doesn't have enough scale to produce the same product in more than one place. And they're doing such small volumes that let's say they do decide to just pick up their volumes, pick it up out of China and move it to Cambodia. The Cambodian factory is just not very interested in this little company that's showing up saying, hey, I need to order 500 units of this shirt. Like they're trying to talk to the Nikes of the world, the big guys. So it's harder for them they don't have the resources to be flying around the world, doing vetting of different countries. It's just very challenging.
So I've got a couple of questions on enforcement here from our audience members. I think to premise this by saying in the United States, you can import without setting up any sort of an entity, which is sort of unusual. Most countries require you to do that.
Yeah.
But if you can import without creating an entity, a member says, doesn't that make it easier to cheat? Second question on a related topic, and I wonder if you could address them both at once here, is why is the DOJ targeting trade and customs fraud? Does Ryan see any evidence that fraud has increased?
Okay, I'll take those in turn, and they're related. The first question is, yeah, you can in the United States. It's United States, countries in Western Europe, I think Canada as well, allows you to import goods without having any legal entity in the country at all. It's called a non-resident importer, also known as a foreign importer of record. So that means a foreign company can actually ship goods to the United States, import it themselves. Like you don't need to sell it to an American company and then go sell it on Amazon or they might sell it to an American company after the goods have arrived. Why this leads to fraud is those foreign companies are many times sort of shell companies. You set it up, register it with the US government, import it. If you cheat on your customs, you declare your valuation too low, you choose the wrong classification code in order to get a lower duty rate, and you get busted. CBP, the US government, does not have agents in China to go after you. You can just kind of disappear into the night. And China, any other countries too. And so it makes it just leads to a lot of fraud because, yeah, it's there and incentives are all over the place to make this, to do this. Now, as for wait, what was the second question? We're talking
about, do you see evidence that the fraud has actually increased at this point?
Evidence. Yes, we do. I don't have access to anything like internal at CBP, but they're talking about it a lot. DOJ has said it's their number 2 is customs fraud amongst the white collar crime division of DOJ. Number one is like healthcare fraud and some other types of fraud that they lump into that. And number two is customs and trade fraud. So that's a new notice that the DOJ put out about 3 weeks ago. So that's one piece of evidence that they're seeing it. Two is you're seeing a lot more chatter of companies that are importers, have always imported the goods themselves, saying, "Hey, my factory offering me these. They're going to pay for the freight and the customs duties. They're going to take care of everything, and it's much, much cheaper that way." And I've gotten a couple to share the numbers, and I had to advise these guys. I'm like, well, look, you're paying less for the freight, the goods, and the customs than just the customs duties alone would be. Like, clearly, this guy's committing fraud, and you got to stay far away from that because they will come after you. If you do it knowingly, and I think that would be a clear case of like, you have to know that this is happening if you're paying less than the duties alone. But a lot of people, business people who are back against the wall, and the alternative is bankruptcy. The incentives are there. People do commit fraud, and you have to warn them. Like, man, you might seem like it's the other guy committing fraud and not your problem, but customs probably won't see it that way, and they are doing a lot more audits.
All right, well, it sounds like a dire situation. Ryan, I'm going to pivot back to the macro picture here and play you a clip. This is Wendy Cutler. She spent decades at USTR's lead trade negotiations. We had her on the show the other day. Take a listen. I'll have a question for you on the other side.
I think many of our trading partners, whether we like it or not, are looking to the United States as an unreliable trading partner and recognizing that they need to diversify the markets that they sell to.
All right, so Wendy's comment raises a question. Who benefits from the diversification? Could it be that some countries are actually going to profit from the disruption at this point?
I mean, I sort of challenge the premise on some level. It's like, well, if you were going to find other customers in other countries, why didn't you do that before? I mean, like, how does losing your customer in the US help you gain a customer somewhere else? It doesn't quite add up. And now it might be that other countries benefit because all of a sudden those factories can't find any customers and they have to lower their prices, and then they're selling stuff cheaper in other countries. But it's easier said than done just to find new customers in other countries.
Right, but if these tariffs raise the prices of your goods, ultimately that makes them less competitive in the market. Wouldn't you want to sell those goods in places where your products are more competitive? And if so, where are those markets at this moment? I mean,
you're seeing like people. Let's say you're a big Chinese factory, big Chinese company, you're selling stuff, and you lost your customer in the U.S. You're like, okay, now I need to find customers in Europe. But like, weren't you doing that before? I mean, how did this help you find new customers in Europe? It doesn't give the Europeans more money to buy your stuff. I think there's this idea that like, oh, since the U.S. is losing, someone else must be winning. I think it's entirely possible that everybody loses in this together.
Well, that's a fascinating debate. I'm curious about how Flexport is positioning itself. Tell us about your Marco Polo program.
Yeah, so we created this program in response to the tariffs largely, but it's a longer term kind of trend here towards diversification, and the world's no longer just everything manufactured in China. We've seen growth out of Vietnam. We grew 50% last year. India, we're on track for 100% growth. Indonesia, over 200%. So we're seeing, and Flexport as a company, we're a global logistics company, help companies ship freight, clear customs, do all of that. And we've been very China-centric historically. 10 years ago, we mostly did China to US trade. So we programmed to move people, about 2,000 employees, get people to move to new markets and help us set it up. So talented, tenured employees. We got over 100 people to apply, and moving people into India is on top of Malaysia, Thailand, some of these newer emerging manufacturing markets where, frankly, we didn't have enough great people on the ground. So we've been doing that's kind of our talent response to the issue.
We've got another audience member question here. Have we seen peak globalization with free trade now in decline, or are we so interdependent that trade will simply adapt and keep growing?
Maybe I'm selling my own book here, but I'm a deep believer that human beings fundamentally want to do business with whoever their best trading partner is, whether it's a customer or a vendor, and they don't much care where they're located. They're looking at the quality and the price and service. And so, and transit time matters. But at the end of the day, you can go back and look at the long run history of global trade, where it's grown 4% annually. You say since World War II, but no, it's grown 4% annually since the Mongol invasions in the 1200s. So you just had 800 years of exponential growth. 4% doesn't seem exponential, but when you put it on for 800 years, you got a crazy growth curve. And I just think when you look at that graph, you don't see World War II, you don't see the Black Death, the 100 Years' War. It's like these massive events that are much worse than some current trade is a little bit out of favor in Washington. It's not. I don't think we're at any kind of World War II type crisis. God willing, right? Let's all pray for peace.
Right.
So I expect to be more trade. And then the other thing I would add to that is it's fake and it's not good because it creates inefficiency. But a lot of what's happening in Asian countries is they're actually moving Chinese components. They're shipping them down to Southeast Asia, reconfiguring them, assembling them, making them a product of Vietnam through substantial transformation of the product, then shipping it to the US. Well, look, you got 2 trade flows instead of 1. But I'm not even talking about that because that's kind of cheating and that's not really good for efficiency of the world the way trade is. But I do think if both those things combined, I'm almost certain you'll see higher trade in 10 years than now.
Is there something the U.S. might have done from a logistics perspective that might have addressed China's predatory business practices without tariffing to the point of threatening our own small businesses? In other words, if you had been the trade negotiator here, what might you have done differently to address the concerns that the Trump administration has raised?
Well, I think one thing I would say is I think the Trump administration is tackling legitimate points in that the trade is highly imbalanced, that if you look at the currency of not just China, a huge number of our trading partners where we have trade deficits, their currencies have not appreciated in the way that they would if they were freely traded. The easiest one is you look at the Vietnamese dong over the last 5 years. It's pegged to the dollar. It's actually gone down slightly, even as they've grown manufacturing, 20-30% every year. And there's so many more dollars flowing into the country. In a world where that currency was trading freely, it would appreciate, and that would hurt their trade deficit. So that's just one of many, many examples. So I think I don't argue like with the end strategic goals of the Trump administration. It's more, do tariffs solve the problem? The answer, I guess the jury's still out. Maybe they're a great negotiating tactic and they get some concessions on currencies or on labor practices, environmental rules. There's a whole range of things there that are legitimate areas. I just think when you actually go, the purpose of them is what it does at the end of the day, and it's hurting U.S. manufacturers more than it's helping right now. So it's easy for me to say I'm not a policymaker, so I'm not sure I have great ideas other than like I'm a believer in free trade and let the businesses do business, and that we want to be pro business. That's what this administration in large part was elected to do.
Now, you mentioned a bunch of non-tariff barriers in there. The one that I'm most curious about is currency. Do you think that currency levels are going to be part of the deals that we're expecting to see coming down the pike here?
I would expect that, and given enough time, I think those types of deals take longer than the types of timelines the government has given to itself, but they're self-applied timelines, so they can drag it out longer. But I think it'll be hard for Vietnam, for example. They've said, I think Lutnick again said it yesterday, that he would not do a deal that was just about Vietnam lowering their tariff barriers. That's not enough. They've got to do something on currency. Probably need to do something about allowing foreign companies to operate more freely, U.S. companies to operate more freely in their country. We can't, for example, Flexport as a freight forwarder can't set up an entity in Vietnam. We have to have a local JV with a local company. But Vietnamese companies can come to the U.S. and set up entities with no problem. So there's some level playing field. I assume it's a whole package of things. But I think the biggest thing that they would like from these countries is for them to apply tariffs to China so that these Chinese imported components are subject to tariff. But I don't know how that negotiation goes, what's possible. But I think that and the currency are probably the 2 biggest things that they'd like to see addressed.
All right, well, we're going to be talking a lot about this in the weeks and months ahead. And next week, we have on one of our internal policies a brilliant analyst, and I'd really like to stump him. So I wonder if you could help me out here. When it comes to trade, what's the biggest unanswered question that keeps you up at night? And I'll ask that of my colleague here.
Well, for me, it is in these areas that are sort of critical for national security. And autos is one, because, of course, your auto plants become your tank plants. Aerospace, you've seen what drone warfare has done in Ukraine. Semiconductors, a whole range of things that the Trump administration is pretty open. These are the things we really care about from a national security standpoint. But how does that mesh with free market capitalism where, okay, do we just run these industries at a loss in the event that we eventually need them? I don't quite know how you reconcile those two things. On some level, globalization depends on peace, but it doesn't really necessarily set you up well for war. And I do think there's real politique that needs to happen of like, we got to be ready for war as the United States. And if we don't have a manufacturing base, especially on those critical things, I think those are legitimate points that the administration has. But I don't know how you reconcile it. Do we just fund them all with the government? Is that are we now that's sort of defeating the whole purpose of the United States system that we're trying to set up? Would be the beacon on the hill for free market economics. But if it only works during having a top-down authoritarianism, it doesn't seem great.
Well, that's a tough question, but it's great framing for what's coming ahead. So Ryan Petersen, founder, CEO of Flexport, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, great. My pleasure.
All right, our audience has gotten their shot of informational espresso and is ready to tackle the day. This has been The Call, brought to you by the Global Intelligence Desk, asking the right questions to navigate uncertain times.